Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, who stole the American dream? As billions are spent on presidential election campaigns, tens of millions of people still live in poverty, and it's not just the poor who are falling through the cracks. Also in Italy, the world's oldest bank is in serious trouble, which means the community is suffering too. And Neil Armstrong's legacy lives on as the global space economy blasts off with more than a little help from the private sector. Remember the 1% and the 99%, the metaphorical gap between the rich and the poor? It was a perfect illustration of that this past week in Tampa, Florida, where US presidential hopeful Mitt Romney and those who support him gathered for the Republican National Convention. They are, of course, in this story, the 1%, those who say they'll improve the lives and livelihoods of the 99. But they themselves will spend billions trying to get elected, or in Barack Obama's case, re-elected, once again highlighting how wide that gap continues to be. Have a look at this. It's a report from Indiana University, which says increasing numbers of Americans are still below the poverty threshold. In 2006, it was 36.5 million people. By 2010, it was 46.2 million. A further increase is predicted for the 2011 year, given the way this economic crisis dragged on. Quite simply, the story just doesn't get any better. And how about this too, a physical representation? This is the Tampa Bay Times Forum, the venue for the Republican National Convention in Florida, but not far away from all those politicians and delegates and journalists is one of the poorest areas in the state, a homeless camp where the real story of America's economy can be found. Here's Andy Gallagher with more.
This is a tent city about 20 minutes drive from downtown Tampa. It houses about 250 homeless people. It was first established in 2007. This is the kind of scene you would normally expect to see in a place like Port-au-Prince in Haiti, somewhere I've been a few times. But this is actually, as I said, just down the road from where you are here. But we are going to talk to one of the residents here. Her name is Kim. Kim, tell us what brought you to the City of Hope, which is what this place is called.
Well, I had lost my job and my unemployment ran out and couldn't get my license or anything, so somebody told me about this place that they'd help me out, and they are, a lot.
So what's the next step for you? What do you hope to achieve?
Well, all I need is my merit certificate, and then I can get they'll pay for me to get my license and then get a job, and I'm off on my feet again.
So this is the real stepping stone that you needed?
Yes, it is, big time.
That was Kim, one of the residents here, one of 250 residents here. Actually, behind the tents further back, there are apartments for other people to get back on their feet again. And joining me now is Sheila Lopez, known universally here as Miss Sheila. She runs the place. Sheila, this was established in 2007. Have you seen the need for people to have tents like this grow in the past couple of years?
Oh, yes, sir. We could use a lot more tents, and I could use a whole family shelter because we have families living in cars with children. This is not a children's center. This is just for adults over 18.
I know you're not overtly a political person, but you're someone who helps people out. What would you say to the politicians down the road when you stand in a place like this?
I would make sure that we're taking care of our people and giving them everything that's available and that we can help them. People have to have a hand up, not a hand out.
Now, you hear plenty of horror stories here, but I know from talking to a few of the people here, there are some very successful stories. What kind of successes do people have once they've been here and move on?
Oh, we have some people that have moved into houses, bought their house, bought a car, gotten a good job. I had one gentleman that lost everything due to the economy, and he had retired, I think from Japan. He's now back in China as a headmaster running a huge college. So we have many, many success stories, and we have some horror stories too.
So you really see it there in sharp focus, don't you? The people who once had homes and now simply don't after the foreclosure crisis of 2007. What you might know, however, is that that crisis has its roots in the 1970s and the stranglehold which big business has had on the US political system since then. Consider this. 4 decades of deregulation, outsourcing of jobs and tax policies favouring the wealthy has meant the 400 richest people in the US have more wealth than the bottom 150 million. CEO wages are 185 times larger than the average American income. And the number of lobbyists has gone up from 175 in 1971 to 33,000 today. Now, aiming to expose all of this is a documentary called Heist: Who Stole the American Dream?
We are the 99%!
This is not just about a crash on Wall Street. It's not just about a recession. What's happened has revealed how rotten underneath the U.S. economy has become.
And earlier in the week, Hazem Seeker caught up with the co-producer and writer of Heist, Francis Corsi, who joined him via Skype from Arizona.
Well, in my research, I ran across the Powell memo, and it was a 1971 memo. It was secret. It was written by a future Supreme Court Justice, Lewis Powell. And when I read the memo, I flash forward to today's headlines of, financial crisis, deregulatory craziness. And naturally, it got me and my partner, Donald Goldmacher, thinking about the impact or the implementation and the impact. And so what we did is we traced the Great Recession essentially back to this memo, which was written in 1971. And it was a free market utopian treatise, if you will. It basically called for all of the things that have been implemented by both U.S. political parties that, of course, most of these policies were spread throughout the world, resulting in the financial crisis.
And you make the point as well in the documentary that this was a bipartisan effort by the politicians. We often talk about the lack of bipartisanship so often in Washington these days. But this is a situation that, in your view, both Republicans and Democrats contributed to. Absolutely, without a doubt. If you look at how Powell was implemented, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Business Roundtable, took the document and used it as a kind of a blueprint for an orchestrated campaign. And what they primarily did, what the document called for, Powell said to CEOs, corporate CEOs, get out from behind your desks, take back the megaphone. You'll recall in 1971, there was the feminist movement going on, the civil rights movement, and they felt they were losing the public relations battle. Corporate CEOs, Fortune 500 companies. So what it brought about principally were two things: think tanks, which were developing free market policy, and then they needed politicians to implement that policy. And so what they did is they created the system of lobbying that we know today in Washington. In 1971, there were 175 lobbyists. By 2008, there were 33,000 lobbyists in Washington. So what happens is the Democrats, beginning in the late 70s, get swept up in this free market utopian ideal. Remember, the free market is based on laws, and it's a question, governments make laws, and it's a question of who those laws benefit. I know many of us have asked this question in the nearly 4 years since the financial crisis, and the fact that we're still asking it speaks volumes in itself. But where is the accountability here? If this was a heist of epic proportions, why hasn't anybody on Wall Street still not been brought to account for this? Well, clearly in the Powell memo, Justice Powell called for the real end game, which was corporate control of law and politics. So you flash forward to 2005, and you look at this, there was a Supreme Court decision in the aftermath of the Enron Arthur Andersen accounting scandal. And the government won, the Justice Department won a ruling against Arthur Andersen that basically held that corporation accountable for what they did in the Enron. Well, the Supreme Court comes along, which is stacked with very pro-corporate justices. The Supreme Court comes along and overturns that. So essentially now the government has no teeth to go out and prosecute corporations. When people watch your documentary, I would imagine it's hard for many of them not to come away feeling angry about what's happened. What hope can you offer? What can people do to stem the tide? What can they do to fight back? Well, you know, when we wrote the film and we were looking at it, we did not have a solution section. And it was quite daunting without a solution section. But keep in mind, you know, never underestimate
you know, a populist movement to kind of arise. And I think what we show in the film is there are people, for instance, Richmond, California, fought back against Chevron for not. If you go to Richmond, California, you'll see there's a refinery right in the middle of the city, and Chevron was not paying taxes. They were polluting, and they won a judgment. They actually, you know, created a referendum and made Chevron pay more taxes. So there are many examples of people who are fighting back a bit against corporate control of our lives. So we do profile those people. We also make some policy suggestions. You know, we've been accused of being advocating, and what we're advocating for really are people that work for a living, that you know, trying to fight back against this corporate power that has really taken over Washington, and very few people's interests are represented in Washington. The politicians, they sit with lobbyists all day. They begin to think their problems are the problems of the American people, and again, people all over the world, and it's just not accurate. So we are representing working people, anybody who, you know, who lives off a paycheck. We're advocating for them, so be it.
We're back to banking now on Counting the Cost, specifically the oldest bank in the world. Now, the fact that it is the oldest suggests it's got some longevity, some survival instincts. But it's in Italy, somewhere which has long teetered on the economic brink, where Spain, Greece and Portugal also found themselves. Claudia Levanga visited the bank's home in Siena and found there's plenty more people suffering as a result of its woes.
The Tuscan town of Siena stood out proudly for centuries as an exception from Italy's economic troubles. Monte dei Paschi di Siena was founded in 1472 and today is the world's oldest bank still in operation. Siena has lived off its profits for hundreds of years, becoming so wealthy it was branded Italy's Dubai. But things have changed. The bank is in serious trouble, and so is the foundation that uses its profits to fund the city's social and cultural life. Investments fell from $300 million in 2008 to $25 million last year. The effects of the money shortage are starting to show. Santa Maria della Scala is Siena's most important museum. The lack of funds means it will close down at the end of August until it will find the money to pay its employees. Siena is hoping to be chosen as the City of Culture of 2019, and the museum is supposed to be the highlight of its cultural heritage. Instead, it has now become the symbol of its economic downfall. David Kitty is a member of an association that promotes Siena's traditions. He says the crisis has hit them hard, but should also be used as a wake-up call for his fellow countrymen.
We've been spoiled by the foundation, which used to pay for everything, and this could be the chance to get rid of our dependence on the bank. We should roll up our sleeves and defend our heritage with our own efforts.
The foundation's president agrees that Siena can no longer rest on its laurels.
What's happened has taught us not to sit back and not to look at the past, but towards the future. We mustn't think our resources are safe and infinite.
Monte dei Paschi is Siena's biggest employer and its greatest benefactor. It used to be known locally as Daddy Bank. Now the people of Siena are like the bank's orphans, having to learn how to pay their way out of the economic crisis.
Now finally this week, space. We've got NASA's Curiosity rover currently roaming Mars. We had the recent death of Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon. Reminders, both of them, of just what man can achieve outside of this world. But things have changed. There are fewer resources, government budget cuts too, and they're turning space into a private sector haven. Inevitably, it's the world's richest, those in the Billionaires Club, who are getting involved, investing their own money in space exploration. In fact, so much so that despite this global economic downturn, the international space economy grew to $290 billion in 2011, with a 5-year growth of 41%. The global space budget in 2012 is up at $70 billion, with the US having the largest of that at $17.7 billion. From Virgin Galactic's space tourism to planetary resources and its asteroid mining, the race to outer space now has a commercial dimension. Interestingly, Neil Armstrong once openly criticised President Barack Obama for his cost-cutting plans, but even NASA now is coming around to the idea of partnering with the private sector to help fund exploration and even to build cheaper space shuttle alternatives. And just before we talk more about where all this money is coming from and indeed where it's all going, have a look at this. Dominic Kane with a reminder of how spectacular the results of this kind of investment can really be.
You can see why experts suspect Mars once supported life. The landscape on show here looks very similar to our own deserts on Earth. So much so that some of the scientists on the team say it reminds them of old Hollywood Western films.
There's a very systematic approach to exploring, moving around through this terrain that looks like it was something that comes out of a John Ford movie. You know, we're going to be driving the rover around in these valleys and looking up at these hills and finding the places where the strata come down and intersect the topography.
The pictures we're seeing here have been taken with a relatively low-resolution camera, just 2 megapixels. They're then beamed from the planet's surface to the Mars Express in orbit, which then relays them back to NASA scientists on Earth.
Essentially, we have a telecommunications network around Mars that's allowing us to bring that data back. We took advantage of the unique capabilities of each of these orbiters to capture information about the landing. Since we've landed, we've typically been using our NASA orbiters, Odyssey and MRO, to do the bulk of the data return.
The sheer size of Mars compared to the Curiosity rover means that it will take at least a year for it to drive even the few kilometers to reach the visible horizon on these images. But NASA's scientists don't see that as a problem, so long as the rover continues to produce data and images that make a planet so far away, so close.
And what we perhaps don't think about as much, though it was in that report just a bit there, the process in which that data gets back to us. We're talking satellites and communications here, the stuff that goes on up in space, largely unnoticed, but is so important to our everyday lives. Earlier in the week, we spoke to David Williams. He is the CEO of the UK satellite company Avanti Communications. We talked about that and also what role the private sector now plays in this space game.
It's a very important business. The global satellite industry does a lot of the heavy lifting for our modern industrial world. Satellites guide cars to their destinations with navigation systems. They provide most of the world's television. They provide a lot of the world's telecommunications, not necessarily directly to end users, but providing wholesale links around the world. Atomic clocks on board satellites provide timing signals that industrial applications use the world over. If it weren't for the world satellite fleet, it would be very difficult to live the existence that we live. But the new generation of satellites is all about empowering people with communication services that have a very big and sudden impact on their lives, and that's what Avanti is all about.
Okay, so demand is clearly high for all these different services. Does that mean it's a busy market, it's a crowded market?
Strangely, no. The barriers to entry in the space industry are very, very high. It's very difficult to get a license to operate a satellite, for example. Those licenses are in the gift of a small number of governments. Avanti is the only entrepreneurial company in Europe to launch a satellite. So there are only 52 satellite operators in the entire world. So it's a small market dominated by a relatively small number of very large companies. So once you're inside the wall, once you're part of the global space family, you have a very significant opportunity to create a great deal of wealth.
Right, so you are able to grow the business, even though, as you say, it's a small market. You are, as you say, once you're able to actually grow your business?
Well, Avanti is a pioneer. We were the first company outside the United States to deploy a new generation of satellite technology which operates at high frequency, which enables us to offer very high-speed data services for applications like broadband in mainly emerging markets. The demand for broadband in emerging markets is sensational. Penetration rates in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, are only around 13 or 14%, and yet those economies are growing at around 6% per annum. So there is a very big mismatch between supply and demand, and that's because terrestrial infrastructure is very hard and very expensive to deploy, and satellite fills those gaps.
Do you think things, I mean, this would bring more competition for you, but I'm wondering, do you think things should be relaxed a little bit more to allow the industry to flourish more? Just, I keep going back to the demand thing. All those things you listed in your first answer, these are everyday things which will only need more and more bandwidth to operate.
That's right. The demand is likely to grow in double digits for data communication services by satellite for the foreseeable future, certainly for the rest of my useful career. But the supply of spectrum in space is very limited. It's very difficult to get a license to operate, and there is nothing about the global system for licensing satellite communications which is likely to change in the foreseeable future. So I think it will remain a fairly concentrated and closely held industry. But those of us who are already in the industry have now got a very big opportunity to finance and fly lots more of these high-frequency data satellites, and we should be in a position to service most of that demand coming from emerging markets for the foreseeable future. It's a very exciting business to be in.
I'd like to get your thoughts, David, on the private sector's involvement in space. Now, I guess we're widening it out beyond satellites now because we've been thinking about space a bit recently, the death of Neil Armstrong, the Mars rover, these sorts of things. The fact that governments aren't spending as much as they used to because, well, they've got plenty of other economic problems, it now falls to the private sector. Your views on that? How much money is being put in, if it's being put in the right places, if it's all the right idea?
Well, I was born just 2 months before Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon, so my life has been partly dominated by the world's space story. You remember it well then? And it's fascinating. Not terribly well, no, the recollection's hazy. Space is certainly undergoing a transition at the moment. It was essential for governments to fund the first couple of generations of activity in space. In the commercial satellite market, commercial companies have been operating the world's telecoms infrastructure now for decades. It's only really in space exploration where government still has a role. We're already seeing that government is beginning to surrender its role in the job of providing rockets to launch missions into space. There are now flourishing commercial companies who are doing that very well. Increasingly, I do believe that you will see commercial companies start to get more involved in scientific missions and possibly even deep space exploration missions. Governments don't have unlimited budgets, and I think where there is a strong economic rationale, you will see more and more companies getting involved in some of the work that was previously done by government.
So then the days of a rousing speech from the likes of John F. Kennedy, who said, what did he say, we choose to go to the moon not because it is easy, because it is hard, all that sort of grandeur about going to space, that, I mean, would it come back? Do you think it could come back?
I don't think it's gone away. Certainly the European Space Agency is still funding a very large number of very high value and very complex missions which aim to map the universe and tell us more about the way the universe formed. NASA is still performing an extraordinary range of activities. I think perhaps there's less excitement about it because we've all become accustomed to the kind of satellite launches that we see going up from Cape Canaveral and some of the wonderful images that we get back from missions like the Hubble telescope. Those missions are still going on. Perhaps we've become more accustomed to it, but the science that we're engaged in space has a very profound impact on technologies that get developed on the ground.
But
so
are
I'm
they
a firm believer
appropriately...
that...
Sorry, do you want to jump in there? Are they appropriately directed? Can you, I know you're a, pardon my phrase, you're a spaceman, but do you understand when people might say, well, why have we got a 2-megapixel camera sitting on Mars at the moment when we've got economic problems and poverty all over the United States and all over the world? Can you understand that sort of thing that people will think?
Well, I'm a firm believer that government has an important role in researching and developing the kind of blue sky technologies that commercial industry is not able to undertake. If it's going to take 10 to 20 years for scientific research to produce commercially saleable products, industry won't do it. But the history of scientific development, particularly in the space industry, shows that when the more powerful governments of the world undertake that research, great industries flourish decades later. So I think it will continue to happen. I think it's crucial that that science is funded by governments, and I see no sign that it will come to an end.
And that is where we're going to leave you for this week. If you want to get in touch with us, though, 3 easy ways to do it. The first 2 of them are Twitter. At Kamal AJE is my name there on Twitter. Also at Abid Oliver Ali is our business editor. And if you're not on Twitter, email is just fine. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's also aljazeera.com/business where you can link on to our Counting the Cost page. We put all our episodes up there in full for you to catch up on whenever you would like. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.